Hi, Shruthi. How are you doing today?
Hi, Nate. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm really good, thank you. I'm really excited that a lot of kids who are watching this and young people who are watching this are going to get a chance to meet you virtually in this kind of recorded fashion. So, I'm looking forward to this. And the first question I have for you is it's a very simple, light, fun question. Where, if you have a favorite holiday destination, where is it?
Okay, so I've got two. So one of them is kind of any place tropical, especially for me going to India often. I can find a lot of places where there are palm trees and coconut trees, and I can be sipping a coconut very close to the water. So
Yes.
that's really special. And then I live in Minnesota in the United States of America, which is a northern state. It's kind of borders Canada. So I live in the metro city area, but whenever we get a chance to go up north, by one of the Great Lakes, Lake Superior. It looks like an ocean, even though it's just a lake. It's the largest lake here. And yeah, I love that. Only in summer, though, I will say, because in winter it's very, very cold.
Yeah, I can imagine. And curious as well. What is your favorite food if you have a favorite?
Ooh, asking the hard questions. Okay.
The
Maybe
important questions.
I'll give two answers for this too. So
Sure.
I've got a sweet tooth. So I love sweets. And right now I'm really into pistachio flavored gelato or pistachio flavored
Ooh,
ice cream.
yes.
Pistachio. Oh, I'm crazy for it. And then I guess outside of the land of sweets, outside of desserts, oh man, honestly, any of my mom's Indian cooking, I think it just hits the spot. It's nostalgic and it tastes good. So what more
Yes.
could you want?
Yes. I can totally relate to that. Absolutely. So I'm curious. A lot of what I talk about and people that I speak about on the podcast that I have, um, often it's really interesting to find out how they became musicians, right? So I'm curious to know what is your earliest musical memory?
That's a great question. Um, I think it's actually surrounded about around an event, not just sound itself. So I grew up in a musical household. My mom is an Indian classical musician. And so I don't know if I even have any memories without the sound of the strings of her instrument, the veena, which is a seven-stringed, 5-foot fretted instrument. It's a huge instrument. And I remember even just the size of it growing up as a kid was really cool, but kind of intimidating, but very cool. Or she was teaching, say, vocal music in the house. All those things were always there. But I do remember when I was very young, maybe two or so, we went to this community sing that she organizes. So she's a professional musician, touring, all those kinds of things. And I got to see all of that. But I remember the community sing had an impact because kind of everybody I knew, all our family friends, were also singing in it, even though they weren't professional musicians. And I remember thinking at that age, probably erroneously, but I thought everybody knows these compositions, which were by a great Carnatic composer called Shruthi Rajasekar, who lived in the like 18th century or so. I remember thinking that everybody knew them. My aunt, who very briefly lived in town at that time, she was singing along, even though she wasn't a professional musician, or our family friends, everybody was there. So I had this view that everybody knew how to do music, and that's how everybody did together. That was kind of my impression of music.
Yeah, and then you realize that you had a really great like introduction to a particular world, right? And other people just have a totally different way of
Absolutely.
experiencing music as a young person.
Absolutely. I was so lucky. And I didn't realize it right away. It took a while, maybe until I was 6 or 7, to realize that not everybody's household was this way.
Yeah, absolutely. I had the same thing with music in church as well. Like that was just normal for us. And then we realized actually in the same way, I guess no, not everyone has that same experience, right?
Yes, yes. Mhm.
So moving from those experiences, how did you then become a composer, and even like how do you even describe yourself as a composer these days?
That's a great question. I do remember writing my first piece. I was 5 or 6 years old, and I'd just been given a keyboard. In fact, it's the keyboard you see behind me.
Amazing.
That thing is still running almost 20 years later. And I remember, it had all these like settings where you could like DJ, kind of,
I remember that DJ button.
So that was my introduction to composition. I'm driving my family nuts, I think, just like trying all these different beats out. And it used to live in the living room too. So everybody was stuck listening to it. And then very soon into that process, I realized that if I hadn't started learning a Western classical piano, but I realized kind of the difference between the black notes and the white notes, you could say. And I was playing around with, and I had by then started learning Indian music already. So I had some foundation of musical, like a framework that I could reference, I guess. But I was playing around with these sounds, and I remember discovering something, realizing that if I went like, and now I look back and I say, okay, there was a flat 7 in there and I can analyze it, but I just thought it sounded cool. And I just kept playing it again and again, this 5-note composition, basically. I think what was really special for me is that all the people around me encouraged that. So certainly my family, they were willing to listen to all of these things. Anybody who came to our house was forced to listen to my new piece. Um, and later when I started learning piano, my piano teacher, always, sometimes at the expense of my own practice, I would be creating little songs, but she always encouraged me and always listened to what I was creating. And I think that had a huge impact. If I were to describe myself today as a composer, I think a lot of it is gathering ideas, collecting ideas. And it's not necessarily ideas that come from me. They're ideas that are almost there in the air. And it's just my job to listen out for them, to really, really listen when the instinct might be to kind of sit back. It's just to sort of push and go. And I think my lifelong pursuit will be figuring out the balance between kind of pushing the music in a certain direction, perhaps, and letting it happen. I think that there are times where each approach is useful. So I have to kind of figure out in any given piece, is it time for me to push a little bit? Is this kind of starting to just sit and we're not getting enough momentum here, whatever that looks like? And is it time for me to maybe sit back and let the music sort of unveil itself in a way to me and to others so we can make it happen?
But do you feel that, because I'm sure there's lots of young people watching who might be thinking that sounds great, but I've been told I have to compose like this or I have to do this, right? So like, how do you see the difference between, having to compose something to, to get certain grades, for example, versus I guess now where you're composing things that come to you, or composing things because someone's asked you or commissioned you to compose something specific. So how do you feel the difference in that approach or those approaches?
Absolutely. I think they help each other, especially if you're doing exercises or you have a homework assignment or a theory assignment that requires you to write 8-bar phrase that ends with a specific cadence, let's say, for example. I think that creates a framework that you can use. I think it gives you kind of a safety net, I might say. It gives you a place, a structure. It's like it gives you if you're an architect, you have a blueprint to start with. And so you know what to build. I think sometimes I'm in the middle of one such piece right now that I'm creating that's the opposite of that, where I wish I had a little bit of a blueprint because I have absolutely no idea where it's going. I have no idea if this is going to look like a house or if it's going to look like a water amusement park, what I'm building. Is it just all slides? It does feel like it's all falling down right now, the piece of thing. And I think there are times where kind of imposing that kind of structure, and I see professional composers do this, that they go to forms like sonata form at times. And there's a reason that those have been there and that those work. I think these aspects of repetition and new material, balancing those ideas, all of learning those, learning something rigorously, whether it's Western classical music specifically or some other tradition. There are so many out there in the world. Learning it rigorously, learning its history, learning how it came to be, learning where it is now. You and I were discussing another art form before the start of this interview, which is also very important to know the history. If you're writing hip hop, you have to know the legacy of it before you're going to be able to create now, right? I think knowing anything in that amount of detail will only help you. I do remember when I finished my initial theory studies, I didn't compose that year. Actually, that was the first year of my life that I didn't do any straight composition because those rules were so imposing in a way, or so daunting, that I found it hard to find my voice through it. My way back into composing in a sort of free form sense is that I arranged a tune. I had a melody,
Mhm.
a folk melody, and I arranged it. And I had such glee in writing parallel fifths again, and figuring out basically
Yeah.
where where my voice fit into that. Knowing all this information, this contents, this theory was super helpful, and then finding your path through it. So I encourage that for people now if they're kind of struggling to figure out their voice after going outside of these homework assignments. I think
Mm.
just take the time to give yourself like a stepping stone exercise of some sort. For me, that was an arrangement to kind of fit into that. And then you can go totally bonkers with your next piece.
I think that's really important because even just maybe for some listening and watching might be thinking, okay, if I'm going to compose a piece of music, the first thing I have to do is be like, all right, it's going to have this structure, and then it has to be like this, has to be like this. But you're saying actually in your career, sometimes you start and you have no idea where that's going to end up. And that must be equally as exciting or almost terrifying at some points, right? Maybe.
Absolutely. Depending on how close the deadline is, it can be very frightening. um, but I think the best gift this job has given me, I'm still learning it, but I think the best gift it's giving me in my life is being comfortable with uncertainty and being comfortable with the unknown, which I think every human being has to contend with in their life. I'm seeing this right now for some friends who work in very different jobs that have very clearly laid out. You study this, then you study this, then you do this apprenticeship, and then eventually you're here, and that's that. But in their personal lives, for example, they might be having a lot of uncertainty, having to grapple with things that are very difficult and facing a future that is kind of blank or unclear what happens next. That happens, right? Life sometimes kind of catches you unaware. And I think that I've had the chance in my professional life to experience that more, the uncertainty, not knowing where I might be living in a few months from now, not knowing which project I'm going to be working on, and then certainly not knowing what my piece will look like at the end. And I just have to be comfortable with that uncertainty and know that if I just keep walking on this road, something will result.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful point because for many who might be thinking, I'd love to be a composer, it's not really knowing sometimes. And this is one of the reasons why I thought it'd be great to speak to you because, you know, going through that process of studying and doing so many different things, and then we'll come to it in a second, just, the content of your compositions and how you kind of pull from your earliest childhood memories to, the balancing the two, the Western classical compositions and, just all of that. Just the idea of actually it's not all certain, but there's a joy in figuring it out along the way, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that people who improvise in music have a very interesting life otherwise. I think it causes them to improvise in other aspects of their life.
Yes.
It's possible their families and other friends kind of don't like that part of them, but it does make it interesting life.
Too spontaneous.
Exactly, exactly. You were like, your family member is like, I asked you to come at 7, and you were like, but time is a construct. It's push people. So, yeah.
Yeah, we need a bit of that. Also a bit of discipline, kids. So don't worry. Don't we can't all just be like,
I am spreading the wrong kind of information.
no, it's all good. I promise, it's all good. Um, so I'd love to ask you about the techniques you use, some of the ideas that you borrow from, some of the South Indian classical tradition and some of the, Western classical traditions. So could you just kind of talk to us about a little bit about that and how you do that, how you think about these two different sound worlds and in some ways join them together? Yeah, just explain that how that works for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I began my studies as a Carnatic musician, as a South Indian classical musician. That's the musical style my mother does. And then I was studying with her. Once in a while, I would study in India with one of her teachers too. And then every year when I was a kid, I used to go to India for a month actually, because there's a big Indian music festival, and I would just skip school for that month and go and eat super well. Don't tell anybody. Yes, and I'm sure it was educationally enriching. It just wasn't in the standard way, I suppose. And they in that festival they have events from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. They have panel discussions and presentations and lectures and concerts, and all of the venues have amazing food. So I'm not sure what exactly the draw was for me, whether it was the food or the music, but I think the combination of the two. At the same time, I was learning Western classical music, but like I said, I started in Carnatic, and my first thorough experience of it was in the school choir, which I joined in what's called 6th grade here, which is like ages 10 through 12, around then. I did not know what choir really was when I joined. I hadn't really seen much of that before. I don't come from a Christian background. And so somebody told me it involved singing, and I sing in the Indian classical style. And I thought, okay, that's the same, right? And as you well know, it's not the same at all, the style of singing, the technique of singing. But I had wonderful teachers who were willing to kind of guide me along and teach me how to, say, blend and sing with other people, because Carnatic music is often a solo style of singing, or you're the lead singer. So all these things were being taught to me. And so one of the things that they had to do is also get me to really read music. So I kind of, during my early piano lessons, was sort of faking it, I would say, to read notation. I'm just passing on horrible practices. Kids don't do what I'm doing, but what I did, but I did do.
But to be honest, I remember doing the same thing. Like, I don't think there's any shame in being like, look, I'm trying to figure it out, and sometimes you have to fake it till you make it, really, right?
And that has been the story of my life, I think. And now I can say I know how to read Western notation, but it took a long time to get there. And I think, I was an oral musician, actually. The Carnatic music is an oral tradition that gets passed down teacher to student. And I was taught to develop my ear from a very young age. And so I could kind of copy what I would hear, sort of thing. But then when I got to choir, it was clear I had to, people were singing other things around me. So I had to learn what was right in front of me. And what I started to do is I would take the score back to the scores they'd give us in school of a piece, back to my piano. And I would play through everything very slowly. And I would label the notes with Indian notation under them in pencil, so I could erase them later and turn them back into the school. But I kind of developed my own language of analysis. This was before I knew what a one chord was or anything like that. But by identifying it orally and putting some label on it, I use the Indian terms for it, I was able to create this system of understanding one language or the other. So today, when I compose, I would say I truly am kind of in this hybrid world of creating. And I think that comes out in my workspaces. So I sometimes write with manuscript paper, that kind of notation. Sometimes that's the best way to capture it. Sometimes it's a sheet of paper like this, where I've just written out the rhythms I need, but I've learned the tune by ear. Oh, I can show you that again. I've learned the tune that I need.
Premiere, everybody.
Yeah, this has actually been recorded by an ensemble in the UK called Corvus Consorts, and they've just made an album, and it's going to come out later this year. But that's how that piece was captured until I put it into my computer. I make a lot of voice recordings, on my phone. That's, I think, my primary compositional tool. Is that way, if I'm somewhere outside on a walk and I get an idea, I'll just kind of record it down. Either I'm singing into my phone, or I'm describing like what I'm hearing, the textures of what I'm hearing. And I also use like Logic or GarageBand as a workspace too, because I still am an oral musician in many ways. And so I like to kind of mock up what I'm creating. And some pieces that makes a lot of sense to do. So I think I move between, I gain techniques from Carnatic music. And then I really do love harmony, which is a concept that really isn't there in Carnatic music in the traditional sense, because it's often like a lead line of music that's getting accompanied. Whereas I love the principles of harmony and counterpoints. I think I love the feeling of democracy that's there often in a Western classical ensemble. I mean, I think sometimes when you have a conductor in the front, it can feel very hierarchical, that we're all just working towards that. But actually, if you took out one element, if you removed, say, the oboes from your orchestra, or you removed the tenors from your choir, it would completely change the piece. Even if you removed one of those people, right? The whole thing is impacted by who is there. So I think there actually is a democracy there. And I love that idea when you have counterpoint and you're giving the melody to different people, for example. It's a very simple way of putting it. But I think these principles, they really resonate with who I am. I remember having that experience in choir, realizing that my personality is also a person who wants to be in a choir and work with other people to make sound, not just be leading an ensemble. Like that kind of resonated with my soul. And so I think all those settings of music making that I got to do have had an impact on the way that I create. And even if I'm composing supposedly on my own here in my workspace, I'm always kind of communicating with something else, whether it's with the music of my ancestors or it's with the performers who I'm going to be working with. You know, I feel like I'm in interaction. I feel like we're talking to each other, even if they're not in the physical space with me. So I think all of those things have an impact on what I write.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I really hope that, again, anyone listening is able to, pick up little bits to, not only helping them to work through their own processes, but hopefully there are some who are listening and be like, okay, actually, I'm on, quote unquote, the right track, right? Like what I'm doing and how I feel about music and how I think about music, and how I choose to compose, it might feel different, but there's actually a lot of people doing it in the same way. So stick at it, and don't worry too much about the idea that you have to sit down with a paper and pencil, manuscript paper, and write everything down meticulously. And there's so many different ways that we're composing these days.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And there are so many different kinds of composers, right? I mean, think about the Pulitzer Prize in the US just got announced and it's very exciting. But I think 6 or 7 years ago, that was Kendrick Lamar won the Pulitzer
Yeah,
Prize for music, as he well should have. And so I think we're starting to get to a place where we're recognizing that, and we're going to have even more of that in the future, I think.
absolutely. um I'm really excited. I was really excited actually when I saw that your name was associated with the ABRSM. So for you who don't know, ABRSM is the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music, and they have an examination. They have exams basically, and which gives you different grades depending on your level. And you have actually written a piece that is incorporated into their, I think, 2023 and 2024 piano grade 1 book, right? Which is amazing, because we've long spoken about how certain organizations have haven't been as diverse as they could be, having many pieces written by similar types of people. And so having yours there represents, I think, something really important. So I'm really curious to know, the piece called Virginia Hall, right? What did it mean to you when you heard, or I don't know the process about how it came about, but what did it mean to you to be able to see your piece at, especially at, I think, grade 1 level, where that kind of entry level into the exams, right? So I guess there's going to be far more kids interacting, young people and people in general interacting with your piece at grade 1 as opposed to at grade 8, for example, right? So yeah, how did that feel?
Um, Yes, it's been a really cool opportunity to work with ABRSM. And actually, after Virginia Hall came out, I did one for their violin syllabus, and there
Okay.
might be more on the horizon. I'll leave it at that. But um, yes, it did come about in a very targeted way, which I think is really important for organizations trying to do DEI initiatives right now. ABRSM has been doing this very cool thing for a few years. I was in the first cohort, and I think it's continuing, of having like a composer mentee program.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing about ABRSM is that they have a mix in their syllabus of composers who we kind of revere in the canon, who passed away a long time ago. And they also have living composers, actually, which itself is cool, because sometimes when we're teaching students, we tend to, we that's how the canon gets developed in a way, is we say, these are the composers you need to know. And then we don't really talk about the fact that composing is something living people do, and it's
Yeah.
not that big a deal, and it doesn't have to be intimidating. It's very accessible. So I think that's why they were able to kind of build this mentor program, because they had the current living composers, or the ones of the syllabus in 2020, for example, mentoring us and showing us how they would create for this. But then what they did is they gave us a few exercises, and one of them was to write a grade 1 piano piece. And I didn't know that mine was going to be selected when that happened. So that was really exciting. And I was just writing it kind of in the way students might be writing their exercises for theory homework. It was kind of like doing a theory assignment again, in a way, because I had a set number of measures, mostly kind of a close range I had to write for. there were a lot of things to consider when a student is learning to play piano. I mean, there was even maybe possibly average hand size. And there are some people who start learning as adults, but many of the people doing grade 1 are younger in age. So we had to think about, how far are you making them jump, for example. And I think the other thing was to think about material that might be interesting for a student to be learning, not just the musical material, but if there's a story behind it. I think what worked in my favor is that you could probably tell from this interview, I'm very much a kid at heart. I'm very much still that. And so I think what I find interesting is probably also interesting to a 6-year-old. I was super fascinated by the story of Virginia Hall, who kind of, I feel a kinship with, even though she's way cooler than me, because she has this sort of transatlantic life, which is that she was an American spy who worked over for the Allied forces, specifically Britain, during World War II. And I did not do that in my life, in case that wasn't clear. But I came over to the UK to study a few years ago. And so there's absolutely no comparison. She was an icon. But I actually, when I was reading about her, I realized that there isn't enough known about her for students, especially in primary school age, for example. And so I thought this was one way that I could maybe help with that in this brief that I was given, in this little commission sort of project that I was given. But it has been beyond what I could have imagined, in the sense that it might become the piece I am most known for in my life, which is wild to think about, and which is such an honor too. And it shows you the impact of working with students. And like I said, I studied piano, right? And I remember flipping through the books and not seeing any names that looked like mine. And that was just fine, because for me, I actually had an outlet with the Carnatic music. There were a lot of composers whose names looked like mine, and I never really felt like I couldn't be a composer because of it. But for a long time, I didn't think I'd be in Western classical music specifically, because I didn't see names like mine. And I know that you do a lot of work on this so that kids don't feel the way that I felt flipping through books. But I think creating a piece like this, I hear from people kind of randomly about, hey, it was cool to see a name like mine at the top of this. And my name is Shruthi too. And what advice do you have for me if I want to do something like this? Or, I mean, some people don't even look at the name, but they're still like, hey, Virginia, who's Virginia Hall? So there's a lot of curiosity that gets sparked, I think, just by having a piece like this. And for that, I'm very, very grateful to ABRSM for using their huge platform to do things like this.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think it's been great to see, the strides that they're making, the ways in which they're engaging with folks just like yourself, and really trying to bring different elements and understandings around music to so many people, because they have, again, like you said, such a massive reach. And just before we go, this has been so interesting, and I'd love to talk to you more, but unfortunately, we don't have that much time left. I'd really like, if you have any advice for any young person, any person in general, to be fair, who is thinking about composing or is currently composing, and yeah, just any advice that you have that might be able to help somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple things come to mind. I think if you're working on something and it's reached a place, but you've never really shared it with anyone, I think it's super important, if you have musical people around you. I used to do this with my school choir or something, is to ask them to read through it, or ask my friends to read through it. If I'm writing a saxophone, please find a saxophonist who can maybe read through it and give you some feedback, things like this. But then the other thing I would say, in even an earlier sense, I have a wall of quotes that I keep here to kind of inspire me. I can kind of show you. And there's one that I think is very relevant here, which is from the American conductor and composer Dale Warland, who is, I think, at least 90 now. And he says, "Go for it now. Don't wait. Don't say, I'm going to do that when I have time. Keep the writing going and let everything be in a mess. If it's in a mess, just don't stop." I think that's incredible advice, because you probably, when you look at a composition on a published piece, it looks all cleaned up and neat and tidy. But I showed you some of my sketches and things in progress, and I've talked about the fact that I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing on the current piece I'm working on. That's fine. You know, if it's a mess, let it be a mess. Just keep trying, keep writing, keep setting aside time for this if it's something you love, and it will absolutely make itself clear to you. It will take shape and it will become something worth sharing.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. Before we go, another question, last question. If you could go to dinner with 3 people, past or present, who would they be?
Oof. Okay. I have Michelle Obama,
Mhm,
Eleanor Roosevelt.
mhm,
I just want to see these two first ladies talk to each other, and an amazing Indian freedom fighter called Sarojini Naidu, who was a poet as well as a freedom fighter. And I think her perspective on womanhood would be very interesting to see all of them talking about. And I would keep quiet. I would try to. You can tell I talk a lot, but I would try to keep quiet and just watch the 3 of them interact. And they might actually disagree on some things, but I think it would be fun to see what they have to say.
I sound like that'd be really interesting. I feel like maybe one day AI will allow that to happen for us.
I don't know if I want to see it if it's
Yeah,
AI.
that'd be a bit weird. Shruti, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And we will make sure that young people are checking out your music as well. And we hope to hear more from you in the future and see you doing incredible things in the future. Pulitzer Prize, maybe. Keep our fingers crossed. We'll see.
Oh my goodness. So
Why not?
lovely to talk to you, Nate. And thank you for all the work that you're doing. It's so inspiring to people like me. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Everyone, make sure you say bye to Shruti. Bye.